Dr. Woolley, how does the ED landscape in South Africa differ to that of other countries?
Well, I think ED in South Africa is certainly an emergent area, with other countries tending to have different objectives out of enterprise development. If you were to look at nations such as Malaysia, they have very clear objectives out of enterprise development that would speak to the linkages and alignment between the formal corporates and the emergent, smaller, informal sector, let's put it in those terms. And the objectives of enterprise development in Malaysia and a few others is to ensure that those two sectors of society engage efficiently and effectively towards kind of a growth domain. So that's an example of an enterprise development objective amongst certain developing nations. However, in our environment, the concept was as simple as saying, if we're going to address the imbalances in our society, we're going to have to grow. And growth requires more hands on deck. It requires more entrepreneurial activity. It requires more economic activity. And the conversations in the B Commission that gave rise to the codes were informed by some analysis done by some global business schools that spoke to the fact that you really want to, in a society, in South Africa as an objective, increase the number of economic actors in a supply chain, increase the number of suppliers, which improves the competitiveness. More suppliers, more options, more competitiveness in the society. So the first tier objectives of enterprise development in the country was to enhance the number of economic actors in the landscape. But it is an emergent thing. So as now we mature as a society, it's not good enough that you have a number of businesses involved in a small scale in various sectors of society. Those organizations in some industries requires economies of scale to be truly globally competitive. Sure. And so I would suggest that it's a journey, and the face of enterprise development matures and changes over time in a nation.
Would you say at the moment we've lost sight of these strategic objectives and we're focusing more on process?
Yes, that's probably a fair statement. I think too often there's been a knee-jerk reaction to enterprise development, with corporates saying, well, we know we've got to do this, we don't know how to do it, and so we'll commit some process and funding to without sufficient strategic thought up front. And that's by no means always the case, but too often it's seen as something out there and we'll contribute, instead of it's in here and it's also about our business and our interface with civil society.
Right.
I see that starting to mature, and I think as the codes now reach a revision, a lot of the gaps that people were using previously would start to tighten up, which will necessitate a more mature view to enterprise development.
You mentioned inequality. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in terms of wealth distribution. What are the implications of this in broader society?
If you look at inequalities on their own, it's a huge issue. And South Africa, amongst various indices, sits with the most aggressive conditions between the most wealthy and the most poor. But when you add to that the imbalances in education, the poverty, the lack of access to many basic services, low life expectancy, we're amongst the lowest quartile in the world in terms of life expectancy. Our average life expectancy this last year is 48 years old. It comes down from 51 3 years ago. So instead of being going upwards, it's heading in a downward trajectory. If you put all of that together as a bath of issues, it creates a certain level of societal tension. I don't know, it's quite interesting when you spend a couple of days out the country and you come back in. It's almost like you feel the energy, you feel the change, you feel the opportunity, but you also feel that tension of what people are saying, what they are feeling. And so I think the reality as a society, if we can't start to address some of these fundamentals, the tension in our social equity has some very real risks in terms of the future stability of the nation.
What can we do to alleviate this tension?
I think too often it's a very good question, because too often we just stop and we nod our heads, and conceptually we feel that we understand that. But I've realized that sustainable transformation of this society needs both people to understand the facts and feel in their hearts the desire. And you don't get born with that desire. I, in my youth, felt nothing. I just carried on. I took what I could and carried on. But as I've been exposed over time to different projects that companies are doing, and I start to see the reality of the landscape of South Africa today, I start to feel inside me as a human being a dissatisfaction with what's happening in our society, with the insufficient change. And if you feel it in your heart, and you feel that desire for change, then you can start to think about and rationalize and understand, now how can I apply myself to things. And my message to companies would be, find ways of productively exposing your employees to the reality of South Africa today, so that they and their families start to say, well, hang on a sec, let me understand how I can be involved. If they start to ask those questions, then from a process perspective, we can channel their energy in a productive way. Instead of a top-down approach that says, let's get a couple of people together, we'll brainstorm some ED ideas, and we come out with a project and we implement. I think you need some of that, but you certainly also need a bottom-up energy with a level of involvement across your employee base. And so my challenge is that if every South African was productively engaging in enterprise development, the country would change. And I think it's that mass involvement that is really at the nub of the issue.
Dr. Robin Woolley, CEO of Transnet Corporate Advisors.